This is Between the Brackets, a MediaWiki podcast, episode 7, May 1st, 2018. Hello and welcome to Between the Brackets. I'm Yaron Koren. My guest for this episode is Dan Barrett, who is a software engineer in the Engineering Education Group at Google. Until last year, though, he worked as a director of technology at Cimpress, a company better known in the US as Vistaprint, which produces custom-printed material like t-shirts, stationery, and many other things. There, he helped develop and maintain the software used for internal knowledge management, including MediaWiki. And at Vistaprint, their MediaWiki support setup includes a surprisingly large number of developers, custom extensions, and so on. But in the MediaWiki world, he's best known for writing the O'Reilly MediaWiki book, which came out in 2008, and which was the standard MediaWiki reference book for years afterwards. My own MediaWiki book, which came out in 2012, has now, I think, become the standard MediaWiki reference book, if only by default, because there haven't been any MediaWiki books that have come out since then, and I'm still updating mine on a regular basis. But for at least 4 years, and probably more like 6 or 7, Dan's was the definitive book for most people. I'm pretty sure a lot more people have read Dan's book than mine, given that it's an O'Reilly book and was available in bookstores and so forth, unlike mine, which has never been sold in a bookstore. But still, we're the two main MediaWiki book authors, in my opinion, and now we're finally talking to each other, which is pretty exciting, I think. Dan is the first guest on this podcast that I never met beforehand, although we've exchanged a few emails over the years. But that's a big part of the reason why I started this podcast, is to be able to talk to interesting people that I might not otherwise get a chance to. And what better person to meet via this podcast than my fellow MediaWiki author, Daniel Barrett, with whom I'm basically in a fraternity of two. So Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much, Yaron. It's really nice to be here.
Your O'Reilly bio says, currently working in the software field, Dan has also been a heavy metal singer, Linux system administrator, university lecturer, web designer, and humorist. So naturally, I want to ask about your time as a Linux system administrator.
Yeah, all the other jobs were not very interesting at all.
Right.
Yes.
No, really, I want to ask about your time in heavy metal. Was it a hobby, or were you doing music full-time at some point?
It was a hobby. I started in high school and played throughout college as well. My first band was called Electric Funeral, and I'm sure you've never heard of it because, frankly, it was so obscure that almost I haven't heard of it. So, we were a cover band playing 1970s classic heavy metal like Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and all that sort of stuff. And I think we may have actually had a gig at one point. So, we were not so big. But in college, I was in a number of bands. We played kind of the fraternity circuit, and that was fun. But never particularly had a following of any kind, but it served very well to effectively teach me an interesting genre of music and destroy my voice and my hearing simultaneously.
Were you just a singer, or did you also play any instruments?
Yes, I played keyboard instruments, piano, synthesizers, organ, things like that, as well as sharing the lead vocal duties.
Wow, okay. And so was there any, sort of costume element involved?
Only to the extent that I was an extremely bad dresser. I was way too geeky looking to be in a heavy metal band. I remember the other band members were far cooler than I was, and they would, go into the woods and do illicit substance sort of things while I was, sitting inside the house trying to figure out how such and such distortion pedal worked or something like that. So they were definitely the cool kids, and I was the geek.
Yeah, you were the technician of the group, I guess.
Mm-hmm. I suppose so. Yeah.
Let's talk about the MediaWiki book and writing for O'Reilly. For a while, I thought you just wrote that one book, but then I discovered that you had actually written quite a few books for O'Reilly starting in the 90s. How did you get started writing for them?
Well, I was in graduate school for computer science at the time, and participating pretty heavily on an area of the internet that's not so popular these days, known as Usenet,
Sure.
Which was a collection of news groups on tens of thousands of topics. And I started noticing that on Usenet, and also this was the early days of more internet email types of things, there were a lot of scams going around, get-rich-quick schemes, and this was actually in the days before spam became as widespread as it is now. But
Right.
there was still quite a number of these things, and I thought I really should write a magazine article or something about how to protect yourself on the internet and how to understand and recognize when things aren't true. And so I started writing, and then realized that there was a lot of material. Wow, I wonder if I could write a book. I'd never written a book before.
Huh.
And so I went to the bookstore and I looked to see if there was any similar book on staying safe on the internet, and there was nothing. So I thought, okay. And I talked to my father, who was a fairly experienced writer and editor at the time, and I said, how do you write a book? He said, well, if you want to interest a publisher, you write up a proposal and put in your resume, and he gave me a number of tips. And so I sent the whole pack into O'Reilly because they were the most well-known computer publisher that I knew. And I got a response back in 24 hours saying, this sounds like a great idea, let's do it.
Oh, wow.
I was kind of surprised because I don't think it's supposed to happen that fast usually, but I think I must have just been in the right place at the right time. And from there came my first book that was called Bandits on the Information Superhighway, a title that I was simultaneously proud of and I cringe every time I say it.
It's certainly of a certain time.
Yes, it was. And so that got me started, and the relationship with O'Reilly has continued for 20 years now. Probably the two books that I was most well known for with O'Reilly were the SSH book, SSH, The Secure Shell, The Definitive Guide, and then also the Linux Pocket Guide, both of which were O'Reilly bestsellers at various times.
And there are potentially more editions coming out of both of those?
The Linux Pocket Guide has been in 3 editions, the SSH book 2 editions, and I won't speculate on what will happen for further editions, but the Linux book has been most active with regard to updates.
Yeah. And could there be more books coming out in the future?
I definitely have a lot of ideas. It all comes down to, the most precious of commodities, time.
Sure.
So we shall see.
Yeah. Just as an informational note, how many books have you written for them in total?
It would be, if you count titles and editions together, it would be 10. 7 titles, 10 editions total.
Yeah. I'm fascinated by the whole mechanism of going through a publisher because my book is self-published, so I've never had an editor setting deadlines or giving me notes and that sort of thing. O'Reilly is of course basically the gold standard for software related books. So what's the editing and revision process like? Was it pretty rigorous?
I have to say, just in 2 words, O'Reilly rocks. They are so easy to work with, and I've worked probably with 4 different editors there, and every single one has been wonderful to work with. The process tends to vary based on the editor. When I was first starting out, there was a lot of back and forth, but as they got to know me and they realized that what I was handing them was pretty close to done, there was a lot less need for interaction. They kind of trusted that I would get a complete manuscript to them. Generally, once you've got the manuscript in its entirety, it goes through a process of copy editing where the publisher will make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed and that sort of thing. And it'll go through 2 or possibly 3 what they call quality control drafts, where they're just making sure the information is correct. And also I was responsible for finding somewhere between 3 and 5 technical reviewers who could read the manuscript in advance and offer suggestions and corrections and comments. And
Okay.
so that's really good. What's great about O'Reilly, I've had some experience with more traditional publishers. A traditional publisher is very, very milestone driven. You have to have 25% of the book done by such and such a date and 50% of the book done by this other date.
Right.
O'Reilly hands you a login on a Git server, and they just follow along as you write.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're really technically sophisticated in ways that I guess a typical software engineer would say, well, of course you would do it that way.
Right.
But when you look at more traditional major publishers, there's no way they're that sophisticated. They're practically having you send stone tablets back and forth by carrier pigeon.
Yeah.
Gotta have a strong carrier pigeon to carry a stone tablet, I guess. But, yeah,
Mixed
O'Reilly
metaphor.
is, they're really very current with technology where this happens. But you do have to write in formats that you might need to learn. Like my books are written in DocBook XML,
Right.
which not every author is probably ready to learn in every field. But for me, it was pretty comfortable.
Yeah. I assume the whole Git thing with the Git server and so forth wasn't there in the beginning. I mean, well, it could have been SVN before, I guess, or CVS.
Well, the very beginning, I was actually writing in LaTeX, and they were converting it to FrameMaker. So it was really bizarre process at the time. But it's been only in the last probably 3-4 years that they've gone to the Git server. And you can actually, once you commit your book sources, you can generate PDFs and see how the book will look as an ebook, as a PDF, for printing and so forth. So it's really, really nice.
Yeah, that's really neat. Yeah, I had to figure all that out myself. But so how did the idea of a MediaWiki book come about?
Well, I guess at Vistaprint, where I had been working, that's a whole story in itself.
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah,
I'd been tasked with creating a MediaWiki system for the enterprise, and I didn't know anything about MediaWiki when I started, or PHP programming. I worked in plenty of other languages, but never PHP. So it was a really intriguing and at times complex learning curve. And once I was mostly up it, I thought, well, if this was hard for me, can I make it easier for other people? So that's when the book idea came about. And of course, when you work for a company, you need permission to work on outside projects like a MediaWiki book. But Vistaprint was great. They said, as long as it doesn't interfere with your working hours and as long as you don't work on it on company time, absolutely go for it, write the book. And so that's where the idea came from.
Yeah. How long did it take to write?
Probably about 12 to 15 months between starting to write it and the appearance of the book in the bookstore.
Oh, wow.
So usually there are 3 months or so between the time you finish the draft and when the book appears that you need for production. And O'Reilly is, again, super fast at production compared to other publishers who might need as much as a year to take your finished manuscript into bookstores.
You could, I guess, sense that O'Reilly was hedging their bets with the MediaWiki book because the full title of it is MediaWiki, Wikipedia and Beyond. Here are all sorts of tips on writing for Wikipedia, and if you really want, you can even do more stuff with MediaWiki.
That's it's an interesting observation. In fact, I had to propose the MediaWiki book to O'Reilly twice with a year or two in between. They didn't believe that the book would be saleable when I first proposed it. But a couple of years passed, and there were over 2,000 sites on the internet using MediaWiki, and then they said, "Okay, sure, we can do that, and let's plan out a good outline and make sure that we're covering material for enough types of reader, so not just the programmer, not just the administrator, but also the end user who would be writing articles."
Yeah. I have to confess I actually never read your book. I did once skim through it pretty soon after it came out, but then by the next time I saw a copy of it, I was already starting to think about writing my own book, and I didn't want to get in legal trouble with O'Reilly or whoever.
Sure.
If it turned out that there were parts of my book that were similar. I actually do have a story about reading it right after it came out. I think I was at a bookstore or something, and they had a copy of it. I flipped through it. Really, I was just looking for mentions of Semantic MediaWiki, which was the thing I was really involved in at the time. And I'm reconstructing from memory, but I think there was just 1 or 2 paragraphs about it, and it said something like, you can try out this Semantic MediaWiki extension. It has some interesting features, like if you have a bunch of numbers, you can find their sum and do other calculations. Now, at the time, there actually was no way to do a sum with Semantic MediaWiki, but after reading that, I thought it sounded like a useful feature to have, so I added it into the Semantic Result Formats extension. That was in late 2008, I think. So you sort of caused that feature to happen.
That's funny. That's right. Now, you mentioned you hadn't read the book. I've never read the book either, so I don't even remember what's in it. But no, I'm kidding. But that's interesting. Yeah, Semantic MediaWiki was not a technology that I had used very much.
Right,
I installed it in the early days, back when it was a tremendous resource burden on MediaWiki, and so we elected not to use it. But I understand now it's leaner and much more powerful, and so it's on my long list of things to try. I'd like to check it out again.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's been 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, some of your books have had second and even third editions. The MediaWiki book stopped at 1, which presumably means low sales. I don't know if you can talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that among the books that I've written, the MediaWiki book has sold among the fewest copies. But I think that if I had asked to do a second edition, that would have been a reasonable discussion with the publisher. I just never asked because I was on to other things.
Yeah, I see.
But it is absolutely dated at this point. It's a 10-year-old book. But there are some aspects of it that I think are very, very relevant. And I say this because at Vistaprint, my team would go to MediaWiki conferences and hear what other heavy MediaWiki users were running into as problems, not with regard to wiki syntax or anything like that, but around the challenges of reuse and maintenance of a wiki, and especially as it gets large. And I really, the chapter that I am most proud of in that book has to do specifically with what do you do when you are trying to bring a wiki into a company for the first time? How do you introduce it to management? How do you use it effectively if you have lots of users and you don't want to have tremendous redundancy of articles and things like that? So that material is as relevant today as it was back then, even though, if you read my chapter on what are the special pages or how do you write an extension, things have changed a lot since then.
Sure, yeah, no, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue to talking about your use of MediaWiki at Vistaprint. It's quite unusual in terms of just the size of the operation, but first of all, when was it created and how did you decide to use MediaWiki?
Sure, well, this is a story near and dear to my heart. I was at Vistaprint for almost 15 years. From tiny little startup all the way through public company and, dozens of offices in dozens of countries. So it was an amazing ride. And, when you start out in a startup, everybody pretty much has multiple hats. They have a million things to do. You're trying to write software at 1 million miles an hour. And at a certain point in the growth of the company, about 4 years in when I'd been there, this chief information officer at the time said, we're growing really quickly, a little faster than we can train new people coming in. So, Dan, go solve that. So that was my mission. We were going to be increasing our number of software developers by 50% in the space of 3 months. So we were going to go from 50 to 75 software developers.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of custom developed software. How on earth were we going to bring these people up to speed? And so I took a multi-pronged approach to this, and I won't talk about the other parts, but one of them was we really need to capture our knowledge. We had maybe not the world's crappiest intranet, but close to it, based on Drupal, and I'm not slagging Drupal here. It can be a fine technology, but it was a system that was installed by a well-meaning person and then just left to rot, pretty much. Everyone hated it. There was nothing really of value being stored in it because the belief was that if you just hand a bunch of software developers an intranet technology, they'll just love it and use it, and that was clearly not the case. So one of the mandates that my chief information officer gave me because we had this Drupal system already and we had a whole lot of other systems, she said, Dan, whatever you do, no new systems. I said, okay. And so I started off thinking about how we were going to capture the knowledge of a startup in some kind of efficient and maintainable way, independent of system. So I went around to all the people in the company who were knowledgeable and said, what do new people really need to know around here on the first day? And then I made a list. Okay, what about the first week? What about the first month or 3 months? And from this, I also talked to new people. What tripped you up in your first week? Right. From these questions and these formal sessions that I ran, I developed a list of about 1,000 topics that people needed to know at Vistaprint with various priorities. And from there, I asked, where can we embed 1,000 topics? What kind of software can we categorize them and maintain them and so forth and write about them? And we looked at a number of different I looked at a number of different systems. This is a small company. There wasn't a we at that point.
Yeah.
I looked at MediaWiki. I looked at Microsoft SharePoint. Looked at Drupal again. We looked at, I can't remember the other systems we looked at, but a number of them. And MediaWiki was just the best across all the criteria we were looking at. First of all, we knew it was scalable because of Wikipedia. We knew it was stable because of Wikimedia's practice of releasing to Wikipedia 3 months before the tarball came out for the rest of the world. And we also looked at what's the name of that commercial wiki by Atlassian?
Oh, Confluence.
Confluence, yes, that was another one. But 10 years ago, Confluence wasn't very impressive. It's much better now, and I've used it. It's much better. But MediaWiki won out not only because of the scalability aspects and the stability, but also because of its category system. It's the only system I've seen which is like tagging, where you can tag tags, or you can categorize categories.
Right.
So you could have tagging and hierarchy at the same time. And I felt very strongly that a good intranet should be accessible not just through search, not just through browsing, not just through tagging, not just by looking at what projects are running in your company, but all of those things at once.
Yeah.
And so MediaWiki looked like the best way to do it with current technology. Plus, I was able to install and get it running in a day. And it was free, which is great for startups. And so that's pretty much why we went with MediaWiki. I didn't realize how great the extension system was until I really started working with it. If I'd known, that would have been another plus.
Yeah. There still are a bunch of other wiki applications. At the time, they were more prominent, I think, compared to MediaWiki, like TikiWiki and Twiki and all of those. Did you look into any of those?
Not so much, because none of them had already proven themselves on the scale of MediaWiki.
Right.
And we were very interested in scale because Vistaprint had grand plans. I mean, we may have been only, some small number of 100 people at that time, but there was this dream of being a billion-dollar company, and we felt like we could do it. So, and as it turned out, the MediaWiki system at Vistaprint was alive when I left 10 years after it was created.
Yeah. And
still maintained and mostly beloved of the people there. So I'm really happy that we made that choice.
Yeah. So speaking of convincing people to start using Wiki and so forth, how did that work in practice? What was the process like of convincing people to start putting information on the Wiki?
That's a great question. I will tell you that at the time at Vistaprint, there were people who thought Wiki was a really good medium, and there were those who thought it was a terrible medium. Just chaos, shall we say. And what I realized was that not all the people who had opinions about the system were decision makers. That's always an interesting thing to realize. Sometimes it's okay to push forward with a system that some people don't like because they are not the decision makers. But what I did instead was I wrote up a business case, formal, on paper, for the chief information officer, remember the one who said no new systems. And I said, here's the vision of what I think our intranet can be. And if we want to get there, it's not going to work with our current technologies because of A, B, and C. You know, people hate the current technologies. You can't really embed 1,000 topics and organize them, and so on. So I've done an evaluation of existing systems out there, and I believe that we can get a MediaWiki system up and running in this amount of time with this amount of staff, and it can be easily maintained and so forth. And so I wrote this up. I gave it to our chief information officer as well as our chief technology officer, and they said go for it, which surprised me because of the earlier no new systems pledge. But I promised that the technology would deliver what we were looking for, and fortunately it did. So I guess the big lesson there is don't be afraid to be constrained by what you think are the rules. Make a reasoned, data-driven argument and see those rules change.
Yeah. And then were there some people who, once the wiki was in place, who kept not wanting to, kept being skeptical of it? Or did everybody just sort of just start using it by default?
Yeah, the skepticism evaporated, and I think some of that was due to just what we did. First of all, after creating a MediaWiki install and so forth, I did something that Wikipedia says don't do, which is, remember those 1,000 article titles or article topics I mentioned before, or 1,000 topics that new people need to know?
Right.
I created one article for each, blank.
Oh, okay.
And Wikipedia says no blank articles, so I organized them into about 150 categories and released this empty but structured wiki to a group of about 20 pilot testers and said, please start putting your information in here. I've already kind of pre-formatted the wiki for you, so you don't have to decide where the information goes.
Right.
If you want to write about bug tracking, there's a bug tracking page. Sure, there's nothing on it, but just put anything you want there. Don't worry about structure and content too much. Just get it in there. And the pilot group had a really easy time with it. And they were all engineers, so they had no trouble with wiki text. And so once that appeared to be successful, we let the rest of the technology organization in. And every single day, I had a regimen that I followed, which was what were all the articles created yesterday. Look at each one, make sure it has an introduction, make sure it has a good title, the strong first word, and a couple of other simple standards to it. Make sure it's categorized properly, and every day reorganize.
Oh, really?
Yes, that was my life for about 2 months. In addition, using various special pages, it was pretty easy to keep up with what was going on. It was only, 100 people or so using the system, which is pretty small. And so, along with that, I also monitored every technical mailing list in the company. I subscribed. And every time I saw somebody put something in an article in an email, every time I saw somebody put something in an email that looked like knowledge that could last longer than just the email, I would do a reply all and say, thank you so much for writing down this excellent piece of information. Please put it on this wiki page. And I gave the URL. And after a month of doing this, I was able to stop because people were doing it on their own. They started realizing the benefits of a central repository of knowledge instead of emails that just evaporate or everybody has to keep their own copy in their mailbox and search for it and so on. So social pressure started to form organically where you'd be in a meeting and somebody would say, well, is that on the wiki? And people would say, yes, it is. Or if they said no, they knew that after the meeting they were going to go back to their desk and put it up there because people started expecting it. And so I guess lesson number 2 is build that social pressure. Keep up the monitoring of what's going on around you. Make sure everybody understands the value of getting that information into that central repository. Because once it's there, everybody has to answer fewer questions from people who stop by their desks. They say, it's on the wiki, have a look.
Right.
And that kind of reasoned discussion had a very quick positive impact on the software development community within Vistaprint. So there were no skeptics after a few months. In fact, what happened next was that 10 other organizations within Vistaprint said, "Can you make us a wiki too?" And because it was just for the technology organization at first. So that was because it was more trafficked and had higher quality information than any of the other systems that we were using.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought it was one big wiki at Vistaprint. Is it really a bunch of them, one for every department or something?
It is one big wiki. There's a difference between what people asked for,
I see,
and what we wound up doing.
Yeah.
So at that point, I was able to start hiring to have additional software developers for creating extensions and technical writers for helping teams get their documentation into wiki format. We started running classes throughout the company for how do you write in wiki text, and the wiki became visible to the rest of the company. And so I started asking the question, does it make sense for non-technical people, human resources, legal, finance, marketing,
right?
Would they succeed in this kind of environment? I didn't want to take it on faith. So we started running tests. We brought in 15 people from different areas of the company, sat them down in a room, taught them wiki text for 30 minutes, and said, write something important. And when you're done, we'll convert it to Microsoft Word and hand it back to you so it won't be a waste of your time. So, because you don't have a wiki yet, so writing something in a wiki is not valuable to you yet. And it was clear that 30 minutes of training was enough for people to do paragraphs, headings, bullets.
Right.
That's it. That's really all you need, and links. But even without links, it was okay. We tried to teach the minimal subset of wiki syntax so that people, when they had an idea in the middle of their busy day, there would not be the friction of where do I put it, what do I call it, how do I make things italics and bold and so forth. Forget all that. Just write anything down. Just get it in there. And later, maybe my team will come by and clean it up. Maybe somebody else will clean it up. But get that information in there. Don't worry about syntax. And we stuck with that as our mantra for years so that the wiki text would not be a hurdle for a non-technical person.
So you said that the first 2 months, I think it was 2 months, that you were basically doing, wiki evangelism and monitoring more or less full time.
Yep.
Did the monitoring ever stop, or was there always someone there on staff, you or someone else, who was checking the latest additions and making changes and that kind of thing?
I'll say it never stopped. But once the company reached a certain size, there's no way it could be 100% effective. So my team, which at its peak was 7 people, devoted its time to what appeared to be high-value tasks, like making sure every article had an introduction so that at a glance, anybody coming by that article could see quickly if that was an article they wanted to continue reading or not. We considered that a high-value edit. Having titles that began with a strong, relevant word, we considered to be important for search.
Right.
And because, if you're going to write an article about, let's say, business cards, because that was a big part of Vistaprint culture, creating business cards on our website, an article called How to Make a Business Card would begin with the word how, which starts with H. Nobody's going to look in an alphabetical list under H for a business card article. So we took ownership without asking anybody's permission to retitle articles, to add introductions, to ask other people to add their own introductions, and to categorize to maintain the taxonomy. And we did that, I would say, for a good 4 or 5 years pretty consistently, at which point the company was large enough that it was impossible for a small team to do it. There were also other enthusiastic people around the company who did it as well, and we started granting them not quite administrator access, but close to it.
Yeah.
So that they could also take on this fairly daunting task.
Were you ever surprised by the kinds of information people were putting on the wiki? I mean, did it sort of expand to fit things that you wouldn't expect to go on there?
Yes, indeed, and that had its pros and its cons. I mean, on the pro side, there was lots of information in there for software developers to get their work done and to know where to go if you have this kind of HR problem, or if you how to market a certain kind of product, or even how do you get a lunch delivered to your business meeting at noon, depending on which office you're in. So it ran the whole range of topics. But we also would occasionally get, I've got an apartment for rent. Is anybody interested? Or, kittens for sale,
Oh, wow.
things like that. So we established rules, my team, fairly early on of what was appropriate in the wiki and what was not. And we said very clearly, here is what is not appropriate. Timely information, like announcements, are not appropriate, and we will delete them.
Oh.
So social announcements, social pages, we will delete. And we did. But the nice thing is, we almost never had to delete anything because people realized, what's the expression? Don't poop in your own backyard. If you want a high quality information resource, you can't put junk into it that's going to become obsolete in a week. And so we eventually built a second system that was for timely announcements and things like that. That was not MediaWiki based. That let people have an outlet for that kind of information, which is very important. You want to build community in a company and so forth, but the wiki was not the place for it. It's not a place for creative expression. Every article should look the same. Don't start doing funky things with fonts and colors and things, because we'll remove that stuff. And we did. We removed fancy formatting because your artistic expression is less important than someone else's reading.
Yeah.
So that was our philosophy.
Yeah, and I think actually it's useful for people contributing to have those kinds of the rules and structuring in place, just to avoid the kind of psychological insecurity, I guess, about dealing with a new page and not being sure, what it should look like and that kind of thing.
Yep, exactly. Keep it simple. Don't worry. Even wiki articles that were one sentence long were perfectly fine, because we would just make sure they had a good title. They were categorized appropriately, and as long as the information was important, why not?
Yeah. Out of curiosity, what was the software you were using for timely information or communications?
It was a WordPress site.
Yeah. Okay. So by the time you left, which I guess last year, which I guess was 10 years later, how many employees were there at Vistaprint, and how many were using the wiki?
I don't know exactly the number of employees, but it was in the many thousands.
Yeah.
And using the wiki, reading the wiki, most of the company read the wiki.
Yeah.
As for writing, I would say, I guess there's a statistic that MediaWiki keeps of the number of active users, which is the number of people who have edited anything within the last 30 days. And it was always over 1,000. So that was pretty good adoption for a company intranet system. And we had over 250,000 topics in the wiki.
Wow. Okay.
So which is larger than some foreign language Wikipedias.
Sure.
Or I should say non-English. I shouldn't say foreign language. That's very American-centric. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah. And by the way, the wiki is called VistaWiki. Is that correct?
That was its original name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Now,
I don't know what it's called now. It's been through a couple of name changes.
Okay. And what is it actually $1 billion company? You mentioned before that was the plan.
Yes, I don't know the exact statistics, but they're all public at this point. But yes, Vistaprint did become $1 billion company.
Yeah. And
is now well beyond that. Though I don't know the numbers any more than anyone else outside the company these days.
Yeah. So let's talk about all the extension development that is and was happening at Vistaprint, because it's quite substantial. First of all, how many MediaWiki developers were there on staff?
At its maximum, we probably had when we were 7 people, I think 5 of us knew how to develop software.
Yeah.
So not all of us were devoted to extension writing. And in fact, at around the 9 or 10 year mark, we realized we didn't need to write anymore because we'd already solved all the problems that weren't impossible to do with extensions. So, times four or five developers.
All doing MediaWiki work full time, or also doing other things?
Also other things. I mean, it was when you have a corporate wiki, just like Wikipedia, it's not just one server sitting there with MediaWiki running on it. We had a whole farm of servers, and we had test environment and development environments, and we also had WordPress servers and test and development environments for those as well. So, we had dozens of servers that we had to take care of. So we were using Puppet for configuration management of those multiple servers, and so we were doing Linux system administration, Puppet configuration, WordPress development, MediaWiki development, search engine development, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So, but MediaWiki was always the largest system that we were running. We actually had multiple MediaWiki systems for different purposes, not just the VistaWiki that you mentioned, but others for different communities.
Oh, okay.
But the system formerly known as VistaWiki was the largest one, and so we had devoted most of our resources there. In addition to that, we were very devoted to technical writing and training. So the same team handled not only wiki stuff, but also training developers on various topics that had nothing to do with wikis at all, but had more to do with software development. And so the people I tended to hire were multifaceted. They could do at least two of the following skills: software development, instructional design, technical writing, system administration, usually at least two of those.
Yeah. Sorry, what do you mean by instructional design?
Oh, instructional design means designing, I guess the simplest way to say is designing courses. A course is not necessarily something with an instructor in front of the room and you sitting taking notes. It could be a PowerPoint deck with a voiceover that you watch as a video, or it could be just documentation, some kind of tutorial, any artifact that's used for training another person or another group of people, or you could be infographics. So that kind of discipline dovetailed well with wikis, especially at this point.
Yeah. So as far as extension development goes, how many custom extensions were there by the end of your time there, and what kind of things did they do?
Sure. We had over 100.
Wow.
We probably had 150 extensions running on the wiki, the others being third party. And it was the way we decided what extensions to do was I'm going to start that sentence over. We wrote a lot of extensions based on the observations we made of users around us. I'll give you a couple of examples. I can't go into too much detail about them because I'm sure that Vistaprint considers some of this to be proprietary information, but I can talk about extensions that we've talked about elsewhere. Yeah. One thing we noticed was that there were a lot of wiki pages about projects that were going on. And every project, of course, has a team with team members with names and phone numbers and email addresses and photographs and things like that. And every time somebody made a project, they would open up a wiki table, and this was in the days before Visual Editor. Right. So wiki table syntax is among the most complex, especially for non-technical people, especially if you start using CSS and stuff in it. So these tables of information about who's on the team and how to contact them and what their roles are were all being done manually. And as soon as somebody would change their role or change their phone number, the tables would be wrong. So we said this is automatable. Every company has some kind of central repository of its employee information. Let's just query that. And so we created an extension that if you handed it a simple list of usernames and surround it with, it was a parser tag, begin and end, that it would become a contact information table with names, photographs, phone numbers, email addresses, roles in the company, and so forth. And so they would stay up to date automatically. So that was an example of an extension that never seen outside of our work. But it was very dependent on the fact that there was a repository of employee information. And so quite a number of our extensions were really inspired by corporate infrastructure.
Yeah.
So that was one. Another extension was companies have a lot of databases. So we developed a query capability, again, parser tag, parser function based, where you could issue SQL queries to any number of a whole bunch of databases. And when the query results came back, it would format in any number of different formats, bulleted list, table, and so forth. And so this became so popular that the wiki turned into a reporting platform.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. There are actually, at this point, extensions that do those things. Well, definitely querying the database.
Yep. I did see those. I have seen a couple of those around, indeed. And then we did one more that I'm pretty sure, well, if anyone else has done this, they're as insane as we were, which is we made MediaWiki able to embed Excel spreadsheets. So Excel is wildly popular in the company. People wanted to be able to view spreadsheets in a wiki page. And so we did that. And it was not like iframe kind of stuff. It was an HTML conversion from Excel to HTML. We actually bought a third-party package to do that conversion for us. And this also became very, very popular because all the people who wanted to do their work in Excel instead of the wiki suddenly didn't have a choice. Wrong. The people who wanted to do the work in Excel instead of in the wiki suddenly no longer had an excuse. They could have both.
Oh, that's very interesting. So there's a spreadsheet in the file system somewhere, and it got queried and displayed as a table or something within wiki pages. Exactly.
And so you had tables that would update when you changed your spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah, that's pretty neat.
We initially did it because table syntax was so difficult and Excel was familiar. And now that Visual Editor is out, it's much easier to make tables. And so I wonder if we would have done it if we had Visual Editor around. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No, I'm not. That's when I'm not aware of any extensions that let you query a spreadsheet. So that's pretty neat.
Yeah, it was interesting.
And I guess well, obviously you can't go through all 100 extensions, but
no, we have released one or two on the MediaWiki.org server.
Yeah.
So, but they tend to be small, not because we're being stingy about things, but finding the time and resources to do open source releases. At the time we were doing that, it made sense to release the smaller ones just because it took less time. So there are a couple of them out there.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Well, so how much of not wanting to release them was just because they weren't releasable? They weren't in a releasable state, as opposed to the company not wanting to give up its information. What's it called? IP.
The intellectual property.
Yeah.
No, there was not a lot of intellectual property concern there. Vistaprint is actually very open source friendly. You can find GitHub sites with Vistaprint software on them about various things. And very, very positive toward open source. It was really just time and resources. Did we want to, serve our employees, or did we want to release open source software? And the only way to do both was to do the simple open source stuff. Maybe they'll do some more in the future. I don't know. But yeah. I definitely think some of the problems we solved would be really useful to other folks.
Yeah. One problem that happens in organizations that have a lot of custom extensions is they end up stuck on old versions of MediaWiki for a while because it's just too hard to keep modifying everything to work with the latest version. That's what happened with Wikia and a bunch of other places. Was that the case at Vistaprint?
We definitely became less efficient at doing MediaWiki releases. We kept up. We were never more than one release behind. But it did become more of a challenge, especially I don't know, around 1.22, 1.23. I can't remember exactly. Things really got different. Maybe it was when resource loader appeared and JavaScript handling started changing.
Right.
And boy, we had extensions breaking left and right, even though we felt like we'd been following the rules.
Right.
What we weren't doing, and we should have, was keeping up on the tip of the MediaWiki development repository and constantly making sure that our software was running. We did a lot of unit tests, so that helped quite a bit.
Yeah.
What used to take a couple of hours to update MediaWiki became a couple of weeks.
Right.
Because not because the extensions necessarily were heavily broken, but some protected variable in some class would be changed to private. Like, now what are we going to do now? So we had to think hard about how to do that, and eventually we started turning down requests to create new extensions unless there was clear business value to the extension, knowing that we were going to have to maintain every extension that we made. But it was still worth it. It was still totally worth it.
Yeah. And I guess that's that's one benefit of having 5 or so developers is you can you can have the resource. It's painful, but you can do it to keep maintaining everything.
Exactly, and painful is true to a certain extent, but I also have to say, MediaWiki's extension system is wonderful. I think we were able to do so many cool tricks with it to meet so many business needs. If I were to compare it to a system like WordPress's plugin system, at first glance looks more powerful because I think you can do like pre-extension, post-extension kind of trickery. It's not just one hook. You can hook into before the hook runs and after, and there are different kinds of hooks and so forth. So it looks like more flexibility, but the whole programming model of WordPress is so chaotic compared to MediaWiki's, where there's an emphasis I saw on constant improvement of what classes do we have, what APIs do we want to have for our users, as opposed to the WordPress ethic, which seemed to be a bizarre mix of object-oriented and non-object-oriented and side effects left and right and stuff. So you can still do a lot of cool things in WordPress, and obviously it's very popular, but the thoughtfulness that went into the MediaWiki API and the changes to it, even though at times it caused trouble for us, was clearly the result of well-reasoned developer debate. And it was, I think the results were beyond what I've seen in a lot of other LAMP stack open source frameworks.
Oh, that's very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that. Actually, I a long time ago I did some WordPress plugin development, but I didn't do it long enough to really get a sense for what it could do. So was there some of that happening at Vistaprint also?
Yes, we were doing WordPress plugin development as well.
Yeah.
And we never enjoyed it.
Yeah.
The end results were cool, but it was, the APIs were really not to our taste, shall I say.
Yeah. That's very good to hear. Yeah, I mean that's been my impression too. I really like the whole hook system, and there's clearly been a lot of thought and effort put into it. But I'd never heard a direct comparison to WordPress.
Yeah,
before.
we also used Moodle, the open source framework for learning management.
Yeah,
and that one is in some ways behind WordPress too. How do I do such and such? A person will post a question. They'll say, "Oh, just modify this source file." So, it'll get overwritten in your next release, but just modify it again.
Oh no.
And so, but Moodle was also a really, really helpful product for us. We did a lot of fun things with it, and it provided a lot of value to the company. But not a mature extension model there, and just things like that really point out the strengths of MediaWiki.
Yeah. I want to go back. There was one question that I had in the back of my mind. I forgot when you were talking about usage of the wiki. One kind of one big buzzword is gamification, which some people have talked about in connection with MediaWiki, like setting up rewards and so forth for people, whoever adds the most content or that kind of thing. Did you feel the need to do any of that? Did you do anything along those lines?
Yes, we did, but not games in the wiki, games about the wiki. And the information I'll give you now, we've talked about at conferences, so it's open, but there are two aspects to a wiki that are really, really difficult to handle. One of them is the freshness of the content. And,
right.
Maybe it's just the one. Freshness of content, making sure things are still correct and up to date is tough. And we built two extensions that tried to address the difficulty of having a wiki with 250,000 articles in it and making sure they stay up to date. One of them was due to the fact we didn't let the casual user delete articles.
Oh, okay.
We felt that deletion was a destructive operation, that the average person would not take the time to look at all the other articles linking to the one you're deleting,
right,
and see how many red links you're creating and so forth. So initially we didn't do that, but at the same time there were articles that were clearly obsolete. We started off by just having an obsolete template that you would stick at the top of the page, and it would indicate this article is obsolete, it's kept around only for historical purposes. But eventually we wanted to give people a way to make these articles go away. And so we created a feature called Archival, which just, if you click a single button, it pretty much looked like a deletion, but all it did was remove the article from search.
Oh, okay.
It would put it into a namespace called archive that would not be indexed.
Right.
Now, you could intentionally view the archive namespace and add it to your search results by using various keywords in the search engine. But so we had this archival ability. You could also reverse an archival if you made a mistake. So we would hold Archive Day, where we would ask people to get out there and archive stuff they find that's obsolete. So that was an aspect of gamification, and you would see who had the most archivals and have a little graph of archivals per day and things like that. So that was one gamification aspect. The other piece of the puzzle was, in keeping the content fresh, is who's taking care of the content on a particular page. Now, in a wiki, you don't have access control and ownership like you do in a SharePoint site or some other more rigidly controlled intranet. And we wanted to preserve that. So we came up with a concept of not an owner of a wiki page, but a curator, somebody who just cared enough about the material to want to keep it up to date.
Right.
And so we had this feature where you could sign up with a click to be a curator of any article you want. It didn't matter if you'd written it, didn't matter what your relationship to the content or the subject was. You could be a curator if you just cared. And so this was very wiki-ish in some sense, because nobody was excluded. And when you were a curator, you got a couple of benefits. One was that you were automatically watching the article. So at this point, there's no real advantage to curation over watching, but it would do that, so you would get an alert when an article changed.
Right.
But you could also set a timer that said, I want to be alerted in 6 months that this article needs to be looked at. And that is then what happened. You would get an email when the article, 6 months later, that would say, hey, Yaron, the article on, designing a wiki with multi-colors
Right.
is out of date, or it hasn't been looked at for 6 months. So come on and look at it. And then you would look at it and you'd change it and you'd recertify it for another 6 months. And so we had curator days where we get people to sign up to be curators, and it also caused their name to appear on the page as a curator. which was a double-edged sword because some users would look at it and say, oh, this page is owned by someone else, I better not modify it. So even though we never told people they couldn't modify it, just the appearance of someone's name on the page made it, there was just a discouragement factor that happened that we hadn't anticipated. So we had to deal with that as well. But for gamifying, Curator Day and Archive Day were two of the tactics that we took to keeping the content fresh. Yeah.
So was that a company-wide thing? I mean, was it how official were these? How much buy-in was there from the management and so forth?
People who wanted to do it did it, and they were effective. We would see hundreds of articles get curated over a couple of days. We'd see hundreds of articles archived. And we also let people mark articles for deletion, and then my team would take care of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, they weren't official in any sense, but our team was well known,
right?
And because people liked the wiki so much, they kind of liked us by implication. Yeah. And so when we would run these contests, there'd be a certain amount of enthusiasm about it, just because people liked what we were doing, and they would see the benefits of not having cruft in your wiki.
Yeah.
And so maybe only a few dozen people would participate, but they would be eager about it.
Yeah, well, sure. No, if even a few dozen, you can get a tremendous amount done. What was that? Once a month or something? Once a year?
Pretty much when we felt like
I see.
There was not a lot of structure to it.
Yeah.
And that was fairly late, by the way, in the wiki's trajectory. So at that point, in addition to wiki, we were doing a lot of other projects as well. So the wiki started becoming less and less of our focus over time, just because things were running pretty well most of the time.
Yeah. Well, moving on, you've now been at Google for, I guess, about 4 months. What are you doing there in general terms?
Okay. I joined Google actually only about 2 months ago.
Oh,
now.
Okay.
And so I am still what they call a new Googler. And it's true, they do make us wear beanie hats with propellers on them. It is true, but if you ask nicely, they let you take it off for as much as an hour a day. Because of the work that I did at Vistaprint in learning and knowledge management, I joined a similar organization at Google called Engineering Education. And our mission is to make sure that the many, many software engineers at Google have the knowledge that they need in order to build software. And so it's a combination of writing and training and tools and so forth, similar to what I had been leading at Vistaprint, but at a much, much larger scale, and I'm not leading it. So that's it opened up a whole range of interesting issues of scale that I had never had to grapple with, and it was very attractive to want to try this out with a much larger group.
Yeah. This is all internal education or also public-facing?
There is some public-facing educational material that has come out. For example, about a month ago, Google launched something called the Machine Learning Crash Course. If you just Google that, it comes up pretty early in the search results. And it is a reworking of a wonderful machine learning course that was started internally. And then it was edited and simplified and made more colloquial and so forth for an outside audience. And it's out there now, and people are learning machine learning from it. So there definitely are external deliverables as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, that's about as hot a topic as it gets, other than maybe cryptocurrency. If you can.
Yeah, two topics with just tiny little learning curves.
Right.
Oh, they're huge learning curves.
Yeah,
My
sure.
goodness.
Yeah. So this year we've had the 20th anniversary of the term open source software, which I guess was invented at a meeting in February 1998, although there is some controversy about whether it was already in use beforehand. But There's no question that it gained a lot more popularity in just about 20 years ago at the Freeware Summit in April 1998, which was organized by Tim O'Reilly, appropriately enough, when a lot of the big developers of the time voted to go with the name open source software. Anyway, that means you've been dealing with open source software even before it was called open source. What sorts of changes have you seen in terms of usage and acceptance of open source since the 90s?
Oh, wow. Well,
I know that's a big topic.
Yeah. I mean, I was doing it in the 80s.
Okay.
I used to be a Commodore Amiga aficionado. That was my favorite system back in the 80s, and did a bunch of open source software for that. Tremendous acceptance now. Originally, open source was kind of the ugly stepchild that you would occasionally find in industry. I mean, open source was wonderful for the people who were into it, but if you looked at companies, there was a lot of, negative feeling about the risk of using software that was just written by some random people out there on the internet. We really want a real company behind the software.
Right.
And so that has completely flipped around, not least of which for the cost savings, but also because I think there are some open source packages out there that have built up such outstanding reputations for being just solid software that it's foolish not to check it out. I mean, even you can look at big frameworks like MediaWiki, or some of the NoSQL database platforms, for example. Various compilers. GCC was probably one of the really big success stories of open source.
Right.
So not only the big systems, but also you look at something like Emacs. I mean, back in the early days of Emacs use, computers just weren't really fast enough to make Emacs look good. So it kind of got a bad reputation for being a resource hog and so forth. Nowadays, Emacs starts off, you type Emacs, hit enter, and it's already running. So it's super fast and extremely stable. I mean, oh my God, this is a program that's been around for, 30 years or something.
Yeah.
It is, I can't remember the last time Emacs crashed on me. It's amazing. So the quality is so great in some open source software that I think companies have seen the light. Big changes with regard to trust within companies, and within the greater public. There's a lot more visibility, I think, as computing platforms have expanded their use, originally from PCs, laptops, now into the mobile devices. It's just a lot more awareness of it, because there's so much software out there now that you can use for free. Not all of it is open source, unfortunately, but the idea of free software and open source software has permeated our culture at this point.
Well, very good. I think that's it. It was great to finally talk to you, and thank you very much for your time.
Absolutely. This has been fun, Yaron. Nice to meet you for the first time. And I understand, as you said at the beginning, you're continually updating your MediaWiki book. I think that's great. I hope you'll continue. Thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Well, thank you. That's really nice to hear coming from you. Thank you. This has been Between the Brackets. I want to again thank my guest and fellow author, Dan Barrett. See you next time.